Hello, and thank you all for coming. Welcome to our audience and our speakers today, wherever you joined us from. We're really glad you could be here. I'm Ann Dodge, I'm the moderator today, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you to this conversation about design and the post-pandemic city. Today's conversation is hosted by the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation, a hub for urban science at UChicago, where we are dedicated to training the next generation of urban scholars and bringing to light the fundamental processes that drive and sustain cities. Our featured speaker today is Bruce Mau of Bruce Mau Studio and Massive Change Network based in the Chicago area. Bruce is an urbanist, a scientist, and an optimist whose work challenges other designers to engage with change in the world. And today, he'll be sharing ideas from his new book, MC24, 24 Principles for Designing Massive Change in Your Life and Work. He'll be followed by our three respondents, Bettencourt, Dawveed Scully, and Tomoko Ichikawa, who will share their own thoughts on how design is at work in the current moment and how we can all bring massive change to the post-pandemic city. Now, first, a housekeeping note for everybody. After Bruce, our three respondents will each have 5 minutes to speak. And if you'd like to ask a question to any of the speakers at any time, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We're going to hold all the questions until the speakers are finished, but go ahead and post your questions as they come to you, and we will get to them as soon as our speakers are ready. And just for a moment, I want to give some context and background to this event. So most of you hopefully know that Chicago has an extraordinary design scene. We have design schools and universities, amazing cultural and civic institutions, leadership and community organizing, and a well-known passion for architecture here in Chicago. You could say that design, broadly construed, touches all sectors of our city and makes itself known as a force in neighborhoods, in institutions, and in the minds of our residents. Here at Mansueto, we wanted to recognize this and celebrate it and really bring some of our city's design experts together to have a conversation not just about the current moment and cities as we find them today, but about what they can be when you bring a scientific lens to the city alongside this commitment to massive change. So I've told you a bit about Bruce. His work spans decades and continents, and his new book really distills that into these 24 principles. You should know too that Mansueto, the Institute, worked with Bruce on a redesign for our own visual identity. And that process was really revelatory for us because we saw firsthand how design can just shift your perspective and change the way you think and feel about work that you thought you knew really well. Our three respondents will follow Bruce are Luis, Tomoko, and Dawveed, all Chicagoans, each bringing a different kind of expertise and perspective on what design and urban science can do for our cities. So first, brief intros of our respondents. Luis Bettencourt is the inaugural director at the Mansueto Institute and professor of ecology and evolution at UChicago. Also an external professor of complex systems at the Santa Fe Institute. He was trained in theoretical physics, and he's worked extensively on complex systems theory on cities and urbanization. Our second respondent is architect and planner Dawveed Scully, associate director at Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. He's also an adjunct professor at IIT, where he teaches in advanced design studio, and is a member of this year's Leadership Greater Chicago cohort. He also lives and works on the south side of Chicago, in and beyond really the neighborhoods where UChicago and Mansueto call home. And lastly, but not least, is Tomoko Ichikawa, a clinical professor at IIT's Institute of Design. Tomoko is an educator and a practitioner of clear and effective visual communication design of complex information. And we're very lucky at Mansueto this fall to be working with Tomoko and her students, where they are trying to visualize and communicate for us the idea of urban science, which is the discipline at the core of all of Mansueto's work. So thanks to all of our speakers, very glad to be here for this. And I'd like to welcome now Bruce Mau. Bruce, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Anne. I just want to say how honored I am to be in such company. I mean, it's a really incredible group of people. I'm thrilled to be here with you. What I want to do today is really look at my own journey to what I call life-centered design. And if you think about a kind of post-pandemic world, what has become radically clear in the last several months is that we are all in it together. There is no exterior to our global city. There's really only one thing on the planet, that's life. We're all part of it, and we're all part of one global system. And the idea that somehow you can put up walls and barriers and does not really jive with the way that life works. And it really brings us to a new way of thinking about what the city might be in the future, how we might think about how we live. As Anne mentioned, I just published this book a couple of months ago, MC24, and it's really a distillation of 30 years of practice, really trying to understand how to take on some of the most vexing, complex challenges you can imagine. And it really was trying to understand, what are the principles that drive that work, and could we help other people think that way? This is the first paragraph of the book, and I have to say it went to press before the pandemic, and when the pandemic scope became clear, I thought, oh, I really need to think about this. And I called the publisher. They said it's too late. it's at the bindery. But I realized that I did a little kind of soul searching and looked at it and realized, I have a kind of profoundly radical optimism about the challenges that we face and our capacity to deal with them, and that hasn't wavered at all. I start with the idea that practically everything we do today needs to change. The world will be almost unrecognizable in 10 or 20 years. We're still doing most things the old way, as if we have unlimited resources. We work as if waste is not even an idea or a problem. We don't see it, but waste has really infected our way of thinking. We treat nature like a pantry and a toilet. We dump everything we can't solve into it, and then expect to eat from it. We think short term and really pass the check to future generations. We dump problems we can't solve into places we can't see. That kind of notion of the exterior still informs almost everything we do. And many of our solutions create more problems than they correct. We're still designing things as if they were discrete objects. And that's really got to change. And that's really what this is all about. My own journey really starts with this project with a man named Sanford Quinter, who was one of the editors of this project. It started really a kind of lifelong collaboration. And this project was on the contemporary city. And we developed a concept of what we call pantheism, which is really the idea that kind of everything is alive, and that we wanted this book to behave like a city, to actually perform a city, not just to illustrate it, but to really kind of experience the city when you experience the book. And it helped for me to kind of begin to think about what urbanism is and means, and sort of how we can apprehend it, how we can actually see it. The second project that really kind of helped form my way of thinking is called Incorporations, again with Sanford Quinter. And this concept was really the end of that discrete object. It's really thinking that everything, every object is itself incorporating objects and systems into it, and is itself incorporated into higher order flows and ecologies. So the idea that we can somehow kind of take an object and treat it out of its context is really a kind of fiction that we've imposed. I did a collaboration with Ram Koolhaas, and it kind of pushed it to another level. And the key, in a way, is the book, the title of the book, which is scale. It's really small, medium, large, extra large, is really about what happens at different scales, that in some ways fundamentally different things occur and become possible and kind of present themselves at these different scales. And then I did a project to design the future of Mecca, which was really, you know, I couldn't have imagined as a graphic designer growing up that I would be called to design Mecca, but I was, and it really started because they have a real challenge with the flow. They get so many people that every year many people are killed in the crush. And it started with a kind of thinking about a 20-year plan. My response was we should make a 1,000-year plan, because if we make a 1,000-year plan, we can't possibly know what's going to happen. We will have to design an open platform for innovation, which I think, again, is another key concept to the post-pandemic city. Books became a kind of central part of what I do and the way that I work and think and learn. I've, in my studio designed 260 books and became an author in the process and began to really publish my own books. This is a project that happened about 15 years ago. It came to Chicago at the MCA, and the back cover really says it best. It's not about the design of the world of design. It's about the design of the world. It's really about the power that we have to shape our experience. It was based on a quote by Arnold Toynbee, a British historian, who said that in the long sweep of history, the 20th century would be about our ability to actually imagine the welfare of the whole human race as a practical objective. When he uses the term practical objective, he makes it a design problem, not a utopian vision. A practical objective is something that we undertake. And when I heard this, I thought, this is the biggest idea I've ever heard. It really kind of blew me away. I thought, wow, that's what it's definitely what I'm excited by. Most of my friends would probably not say it in this grand way, but it ultimately is what they're doing. They're interested in making the world a better place. And the very interesting thing to me in retrospect, I didn't really tune in at the time, but in retrospect, from an urban perspective, the welfare of the whole human race suggests something new, which is that we start to actually imagine the whole world. We start to see the world and design the world. And that's really what we set out to do. We wanted to know, is this true? He said that in 1957. So we started a school called the Institute Without Boundaries in Toronto. And we did the project Massive Change. And we organized it around what we call design economies. And it's really the regions of your life that are being designed. In some cases, being invented and designed. This is the image economy. It's like you're standing inside of the electromagnetic spectrum. The images you see in color are what you would see with your eye. Everything else is the other wavelengths of the spectrum. It's like we've turned the entire spectrum into an eyeball so that we can see the universe and make better decisions. We looked at the economy of manufacturing, that we're introducing a whole new paradigm of waste equals food, that we will ultimately eliminate the need for raw materials and banish waste, that we will eliminate the idea of waste. We looked at the market economy. It's not a natural space, it's a design space, and the design of life itself, that where we realize that what we are really doing is designing evolution. That when we installed that in the museum, you could imagine some people were a little bit shocked by that. But the reality is that we've been doing it for thousands of years. If you have a dog and it's not a wolf, you're on my side, because we designed that dog. It's not a surprise that dogs are man's best friend, because we designed them to be that. And the idea that we can actually do it with a lot more precision is really where we are now. And we looked at designing the urban, that we will create urban shelter for the entire world population. Imagine for a moment the planet, and draw a line on that planet that bisects the population, that half of the population lives on one side and half on the other. Before 2050, we're going to build half of that world again. So half, I mean, imagine what that means. Half of the world has to be built again to meet the needs of a new generation. And that is one of the greatest opportunities in human history. It's also one of the greatest challenges, and we really need a kind of new way of thinking, because mostly we've designed it in opposition to the natural world and not really in a synthesis. One of the domains that we looked at was the information economy. And we discovered something there that in retrospect, again, was really profound. The we will statement was, we will build a global mind, that ultimately we will connect information around the whole world. And our thesis was that if Toynbee was right, we should be producing projects that visualize the whole world, so that we can actually, you know, if we're going to consider the whole world and the welfare of the whole world, we're going to have to see it. And we set out to discover, you know, was that really true? And what we found was really extraordinary. We installed a gallery of global portraits, a gallery of projects from all over the world, where people were assembling the data to see the world. And for the first time, really producing images. One of the images that we included was the very transformative image of the ozone hole. It was the first real global image that changed global behavior. And all the other projects were all different dimensions. You know, one of them was a project out of Japan that was the first model of the global ocean currents, where you could really see the impact of global warming. What really came out of that process was a new understanding of design. On the left is the old way, that design is a subset of business. Business happens in a cultural context. Culture happens in the natural world. And what we discovered was that we have a new set of responsibilities, that business, culture, and even nature are now design projects, that we are now at a point in our world where we are designing the natural world. And I remember when I first showed this and talked about it, a lot of people said, Bruce, you're crazy. You're a megalomaniacal nut. You just want to control everything. Because they assume design is about control. And I said, no, actually, it's not about control. It's about responsibility. Where we fail to design, we design for failure. And you can see all over the world where we fail to design the ecologies that sustain us, we destroyed them. And we're now having to go back and apply design and really design those natural systems in order to recover them. When the show opened in Vancouver, before it came to Chicago, I went to a high school to do a presentation like this, and I did this, showed some of the work, and a young woman came to the mic after the presentation, and she said, Mr. Mao, I think you're not thinking big enough. And I said, really? Because these days, most people don't accuse me of that. I have the opposite problem. And I said, tell me more. And she said, well, the welfare of the whole human race was really last century. That was, the 20th century. The 21st century project, our generation, has to consider the welfare of all of life. And I have to say, I was just absolutely blown away. She was absolutely right. She saw a blind spot. Because we were looking at a perspective from the 50s, we still had that kind of approach. And it really changed the way that, fundamentally changed the way that I thought and worked, and we've been working ever since. Now, about 10 years ago, I was made a honorary royal designer for industry, part of the RSA in London. And as part of the process, they sent a group of young leaders to talk to us. And they wanted to know, are there principles in what we do? And I, how do we do it? They were asking. Because we were doing, cities and carpets and, products and brands and businesses, social movements. They wondered how on earth we were able to do that, and asked if there were principles. And I really didn't know how we did it, frankly. I'm somewhat embarrassed to say. it just evolved organically over a long period of time that we had figured out how to do this kind of design. And so we sat down, BC Williams is my wife and partner, and we sat down together and started to say, you know, what are the principles that inform all of our work, that if I could teach you how to think like this, it would advance your work, it would accelerate your work. And we ended up with 24 of them, and these are the principles. And they are, in some cases, really disorienting. They change the way that we understand how we live and work, and they're really challenging, how we run our business, how we conduct ourselves, etc. And I wanted to just touch on a few of them, if I have the time to do that. The first is the first one. It's really first inspire, design is leadership, lead by design. And the idea is that we take responsibility for inspiration. We don't leave it to chance. We don't leave it as a side effect. We really think that is our principal responsibility. And it's a power that we have as designers that I think most designers don't really understand. They don't realize how powerful they are in imagining the future. The second is design the invisible. If you think about what happened in art, almost 100 years ago, Duchamp worked to liberate art from what he called the tyranny of the eye. And he said, I was interested in ideas, not merely visual products. That so far hasn't happened in design. All of our design tools are about the eye. What we said is, look, we have to think about a much bigger kind of impact of design and think about the systems that support us. And then I want to end with this, that we are not separate from or above nature. And for me, this is one of the principles that really changes our thinking about the city. We really, for most of history in the West, we were taught and we learned that we owned nature, that we were separate from it, that we're different. We weren't part of the natural world. We were a special case. We had an extraordinary experience of going into the jungle in Panama with E.O. Wilson. And he explained there's only one thing on the planet, it's life. We're part of it. And we depend on the ecological systems that sustain us. And still so much of what we do is in opposition to that natural world and not really a synthesis, as I mentioned. And I wanted to end with this idea, islands of intelligence in a sea of stupidity, which is part of this principle. When I was a kid, I worked as a canoeing instructor in Northern Ontario, a place called Algonquin Park, and I would take kids from the city for 10 days into the park. And when we were in the park, we behaved like citizens. We took out what we brought in, we left the campsite as we found it. We were intelligent in our conduct. The moment that we left the park, all bets were off. We could behave like total idiots and just do anything. And what we realized is that the park as a concept is a hall pass. It's a permission slip that allows us to trash the rest of the world. And if you look at how much of the land in America is protected, including all natural parks, nature reserves, it's a tiny fraction, and we need to invert this diagram. We need an island of stupidity in a sea of intelligence as the future of urbanism. So I want to end with this concept. There's only one city, and we all live in it. And I think that if you think about what has happened in this pandemic experience, it really allowed us to experience this, to see it, to really understand that there's one city, we live in it, and we're all in it together. That really comes from an experience that I had with working in Northern Ontario. In my hometown, there's a new school of architecture there. And they are developing a way of thinking and working that really gets to a new way of understanding the city, understanding architecture and design. And this is one of the projects that they do. And it really comes from a cosmology with their indigenous collaborators that puts life, not humans, at the center. And that's really what life-centered design is all about. So thank you so much, and I will now hand to Luis.
Thank you, Bruce. Let's see. Do you have the other slide?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. All right, everybody. So Bruce, wow, you know, I love to just hear you talk, and I have to say that MC24 and Massive Change before it were really formative for me and allowing me to think in different ways and to think about systems and of course to think about cities. And in particular, your book, as I was reading it even more intensely because of this event, has been one of the brightest spots of my last 6 months in terms of opening windows to transcend our current crisis, but also giving us tools to think about a different future, a future that we have to imagine together. So that's really a gift, and I'm really thrilled that we could do this together. And when we were thinking about an image for the Institute even, I thought it can only be Bruce. It has to be Bruce. So here we are. Thank you for the collaboration. Now, one of the things I'm very happy to do is that I work in what I love. And the thing that I love is massive change. I want to understand it and in some ways think of making the world a better place with ideas and action. And it is in cities that, in my own experience, I've seen this massive change, both in terms of new ideas, things percolating up, new behaviors, smells, senses, many other things. Every city has a bit of the germ of the future. And it is there that I sort of want to start as I react a little bit to sort of what you shared with us. And I think design for me, as I've had the pleasure of talking to you and to Tomoko and Dawveed and many, many others, Sanford even, has really been sort of a window into a different way of thinking and a different way of acting. It's different from science, it's different from the humanities, it's different certainly from the applied sciences of engineering or policy. It really gives you a different window, a different mandate, and a different kind of set of objectives that I think is essential, but often we don't consider. So this image is kind of putting us on a frame that relates to some of the things you said. So it's an image of two worlds. It's two visions, in some ways, two visions of the future. So on the left, those two panels are sort of the bird's eye view of the city, as we've had many. And it's a view of the future in terms of a smarter city. This is one of the prototypes for, this is Masdar City, which was going to be constructed in the Emirates. And it has many good things about it. It's the city that's going to be completely powered by solar. It's going to be almost circular in terms of its resources. It does many things well. And it has these funky little vehicles that you can see there that I'd love to drive. That has even sort of a Bruce Mao kind of exhaust. I don't know what that was, but it's kind of cool. But the color is kind of one of the colors you use, I think. But this is not a city at all, right? The problem with these things is that this is not a city because it failed to consider people. And more to the point, it fails to consider relationships between people. It's also kind of perfect, so it cannot change. It's a city that's kind of frozen by its sort of perfection and sort of final solution. So this has not been built like this. It's in fact a bit of an office park. On the right, what you have is a completely different reality. Two cities, the same planet, like many other cities, one city, as you said. It's Lagos, Nigeria, right? And it's a market. It's one of the great markets in this city. It's a fascinating, you know, thrilling market. It's a little dangerous. It's full of people that look in all kinds of ways, the smells, the density, you can see it. It's a really exciting place. But, you know, this is a real city, damn it, right? It really is a real city. But it's also a real city full of problems, right? All the problems of cities, the density, the pollution, yes, the poverty, the informal environments, the exposure to climate change, it's sort of a coastal city in a lagoon, is really critical. And Lagos is important because it's going to be the largest city in the world from demographic projections. And by the end of the century, it's supposed to maybe reach something like 80 million people, 80. So twice the size of Tokyo today, that's there behind Tomoko. And so if you think about that, right, that means that it's going to have to be, you know, more efficient, have better transportation, better environment than Tokyo. It's going to have to be more sustainable than Copenhagen. It has to be, you know, build environment, as you said, faster than Shanghai. And it has to be richer than New York City, right? In just a few decades. How is that going to happen? What's that kind of massive change? So my point about bringing this up is that we don't know, right? we've not had the mental tools or the practical tools to really think about this kind of massive change that tends to happen through cities. And we've not had, in other words, the science or the art, and therefore we've not had actually the right kind of design, or some design, to kind of foster this imagination and imagine futures that can actually work and that play out across scales and are multidimensional and systematic. So this is what excites me about the collaboration between science and urban science and design, is that this is being built now by people like us and many others throughout the world, now that we can talk across the world and see you know, Chicago and Lagos in the same picture. Now, what I think science tells us, just to put us on a different frame, is that science tells us actually that cities are not about the visible. They're not about what we see in these pictures. Cities are really about relationships, the interactions between people. So they're not really about people, the built environment or roads. They're really about what happens between people at many different scales, from friendships and life at home to civic life to imagining the future. But they're also about information. When we are in these environments, we think differently, we act differently, we invent new things, we push each other. And some of this invention is by necessity, some of it is by inspiration. But this is why I think cities are such platforms for innovation. One of the platforms that I think you highlight in the book. They're really, in some sense, the biggest machine, the biggest environments where we invent and transcend the present together. But this is very difficult. It's very difficult, as you know, under COVID, and now coming to the present situation, to really act together in the benefit of the future and the benefit of most people. And so many of sort of the challenges of massive change are challenges of collective imagination and challenges of collective action. And this is kind of the crisis that we're in, because in order to succeed at that, these platforms need to work. We need to be connected, and we need to have a long-term vision. And at the moment with COVID and some of the other crises affecting us, our universe is collapsing, right? We're looking inside our own homes with a shorter term environment, looking at emergencies. And so this is kind of, and so the picture behind me is kind of the metaphor for this, right? We're together, but we're all separate in our own circle, right? Or we're all at home. And so what COVID is doing is kind of undermining a lot of the dynamics that make these platforms of innovation that cities can be work together and work towards the future. So I think what we need in many ways is to foster these platforms that allow people to come together in wicked teams, a term that you use to solve wicked problems, I think, and find a way in which all cities have a little bit of Masdar, a little bit of Legos, but are fundamentally something different and better that solve problems of sustainability that are real to the human experience and the human aspiration. So I'm very excited to be here with you and think about ways in which designers, scientists, and many other people can come together, including with the people that are there on the ground in Lagos, to think about a different world. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Our next respondent is Dawveed Scully.
All right, thanks you guys. And as mentioned, it's the same. I'm really inspired by Bruce and kind of the group that's been put together on this panel, and I've been really, I think, just touched by the principles, and to kind of react to that really kind of stuck out to me. And this is an image, just to start with, about the city I live in. This is the Woodlawn neighborhood here in Chicago, and like we see this, kind of all over. And you could go to Atlanta, you could go to, so Detroit. You see this sort of vacancy, or sort of just lack of engagement with the city. And I think it's really important to understand, kind of to Bruce's points and others earlier, that this is a designed outcome. Like the vacancy, the space that's not here, the drastic decline in the neighborhood from 80,000 people to 24,000 in population over the last sort of 50 years is a designed outcome. And us as designers and just thought leaders, we should need to work together to start to think about how to move these forward. And I think kind of to build on the a couple of themes, the principles that Bruce set forward, two really kind of stuck to me. One really about designing your own economy, and the second really being about the wicked problems and wicked teams, because these are, kind of systemic issues. So how do we start to look and form of that? And, kind of one recent example in the Inglewood neighborhood, where, they have a lot of vacant land, but a lot of it's privately owned. And it was really interesting talking with residents there and community activists, artists. They don't own this property, but they were able to get permission to actually take it over and to reactivate it as the space and bring art and bring, kind of energy to it and start to look at this idea of envisioning, get the community to really believe that they have a stake and they have, they're part of the solution. And on the side of this building, they put this this group called Alt Market, and they have these all over different parts of the city. But basically, it's a free market, and it's about exchange versus, kind of commerce. They understand that, people need resources, and in the pandemic, and because of the, job loss, economic opportunity, et cetera, there's really has been a need to engage one another in a different way. So this project really spoke to me about this idea of designing, your own economy. And it really kind of gets me to thinking about how, how do we then start to work together, kind of the policy folks, the economic, business, sort of design community, how do we all work together to start to really rethink, these systems and how they're working and how they're operating, because this is, kind of an anomaly, and it probably shouldn't be, right? Like there should be more reciprocity and engagement between each other and understanding about, systems, neighborhood systems, food systems, support, and then, kind of to build on the idea of wicked problems and needing wicked teams. I mean, we've seen so much of this through the pandemic, right? The, racial, sort of injustice issues with George Floyd and others, climate change and, kind of the wildfires, in California, other, kind of natural events, and just in general biodiversity. How do we support ourselves in these sort of environments? And one of the things that's really come up is, kind of our resources. Like right now, we're kind of all in our homes and we're using the Amazons and, kind of those other resources to get things to us. But how do we start to make sure that those places and people can thrive, and that all these systems are actually interconnected and they relate to one another? And there's groups out there starting to engage in that. There's a group called Design as Protest that's really kind of rose up among the design community of color and LGBTQ community of designers, trying to figure out, like how do we start to both understand our role as, people that create objects, create places, create buildings, and these, kind of key and core areas, whether it's the carceral state, whether it's the, police funding, whether it's affordability in neighborhoods and livability. So how do we start to really build collaborations and use this time to network and connect with each other outside of our silos, so that we can then start to address some of these systemic issues. And I want to leave you guys on this slide. This is a real image. I often get asked, is this photoshopped? And it's not. That this sort of duality and this sort of externality that Bruce talked about, especially around, sort of almost putting things in buckets. Like we're like, okay, this is the poor bucket, this is the rich side, this is that, this is the open space, this is the city. Like, how do you start to really break down those walls and start to understand that these systems really need to be rethought holistically to understand how we can move forward into the next century and into the future, to start to really think about new metrics and new themes and focus on life and livelihood as part of how we start to understand prosperity instead of maybe, kind of financial prosperity or others. And I'll pass it on to Tomoko to add on.
Thank you. Hope everybody can hear me. I just realized that I'm probably an anomaly of this set of four. I am not an urbanist. I am an information designer, which is why you are not seeing a picture of a city, but you're seeing a painting of Saturn. And I have two images that I would like to share with you today. But before we go there, I'm just really wanted to express my delight and pleasure for being included in this panel today. Thank you very much for the invitation to Luis and the folks at Mansueto. So this is actually a painting. This is a painting that was painted in 1944 by a man named Chesley Bonestell. He's a space artist. This is before we had any imagery, photographic or satellite or otherwise, of what Saturn looked like. And I'm using these images as a way to symbolize some themes around design. And within each of the themes, I'll talk a little bit in terms of how it relates to the pandemic. You know, and he was able to create this painting without the information that we have now. He basically learned about space from other experts in other areas. And he was able to put those information pieces together and create this, right? And so what I wanted to symbolize using this about design is that it is very, very bold. Nobody has seen anything like this before. Nobody had put forth anything like this before. And so what we do as designers is we create bold visions. And I think as you saw today with Bruce's work and the principles that he put forth, you know, design is a very bold endeavor. And so what he did, what Bonestell did for us is that he was able to create sort of information-inspired imaginations. It didn't come from nowhere. He did have information, but he was able to put forth an image that for us was never seen and has inspired many, many people in the aeronautical industry to want to become astronauts, to go into NASA and to go seek space. So design is about envisioning. We put forth ideas and we have methods to do this, to put ideas forward so that we can envision a future that we don't know what it exists yet. We think about the word design, and many of you may have heard the term design thinking recently. It's become a part of our lexicon. Even business students are learning about design thinking. But what design actually does is the design doing, is the design envisioning part that sets it apart. How does this relate to the pandemic? We have heard the word reset a lot recently, because all the things that we touch in our lives today is being changed because of the pandemic. We are talking about, well, we need to hit this gives an opportunity to hit the reset button. And so in terms of boldness, the question becomes, well, to what level do we hit the reset button? Do we start from scratch with many of the things? What are the things that we can salvage to move forward in the cities that we are living in, and in non-cities as well, but mainly in cities because it's very dense and populated. Another theme that I think Bonestell's painting harkens with design is the idea that design is big. Many of you may not know this, but you know, there's a lot of parts of design that is invisible. And you know, if I ask the public what they think about design, they only talk about or reference things that are visible and things that are tangible. So that's why, you know, things like fashion design or furniture design or interior design or web design might come into their thinking. And it's true, as Bruce mentioned, as designers, we created artifacts. But since then, the field of vision for design has widened. And so we've moved beyond that to design things like processes and experiences and services. And we now are in the business of thinking about systems and systems thinking for design. And so, you know, what the pandemic has done for us is that we realize that every aspect of our lives, every system that we touch in our everyday living has been impacted by the pandemic. Not just healthcare, but safety nets in terms of things like insurance, right? Education, as you see, how we are not able to socialize with each other on campus, and we are doing Zoom classes like this now. What does that do? You know, systems like labor, systems like transportation and leisure, systems like retail, you know, waste management, right? And even down to the judicial and legal systems. These have all been impacted by the pandemic. And so we have an opportunity to think about how we can reset and move forward and provide solutions that are specific to the demands at hand. Another aspect that has been widened in terms of design, in our view, is the idea that it's not just about humans anymore. We talk about non-human actors in design as well. And so to me, when I heard about that, you know, when we think about humans conquering nature or humans versus nature, it struck to me that it's a very Western concept. It's a very American concept brought on by the pioneer spirit, perhaps, or by, you know, embodied by phrases like "Go West, young man," or, you know, the whole idea of the Homestead Act, where, you know, people actually did go and conquer land. Other cultures have a different way of thinking about the relationships between humans and nature. Where I come from in Japan, the concept of Shintoism coexists with Buddhism, and the idea that there are gods in everything that we see. There are gods in trees, there are gods in oceans, there are gods in the sky. You know, if you are a fan of Studio Ghibli and the animations by Hayao Miyazaki, such as Totoro, My Neighbor, or Spirited Away, or Princess Mononoke, you will see that the different types of relationships between man and nature are presented there. So the idea of learning from non-dominant cultures, I think, is a big part of design's theme right now. Dawveed, can I ask you to advance the, thank you. So another picture of Saturn, not a city. This is actually a photo that was taken by the Cassini spacecraft in 2017 before it was decommissioned. So this is a different technology that has captured the same subject in comparison to what we just saw with Bonestel's painting, right? And this is a symbolization of another theme for design, which is about data and how we collect the data and what we base our envisionings upon, right? What are we using as a way to inspire us and to think about and be informed by the world, and how it informs us as to what we need to solve and how we can solve them. You know, design and a subset of design, which is called design research, has methodologies to go and understand the world through primary and secondary research methods. But if data is to be an integral part of designers' information about how to create the visions for the future, we have to question those data. Like, where does it come from? Did we collect them ourselves? How are we collecting them? If we are using other people's data sets that already exist, you know, understanding the context in which those data sets were collected, what kind of bias might be embedded in the data set that we are using to make decisions upon. Design is a decision-based exercise. It's a task that we do that's very much decision-based. And so, you know, even thinking about this year's census and the issues that we are having in collecting data, how can we use that? Can we actually reliably use the data coming out of census this year to help us be informed about things like allocating funds or representation, right? That's what the census is about. So rather than blindly using data, we need to be able to question that. And then the fourth and final theme that I wanted to bring up is the idea of application and implementation. You know, Bonestel had inspired many, many people to go into space. That was the application of his painting. You know, in design, we think about application and implementation through prototyping to help us think about how to advance our ideas forward. And so, or what should we develop, right? And then the types of principles that Bruce is bringing about and presenting us today is to think about how to develop them. And so, you know, with the pandemic, I would love to see principles combined, not just singularly, but combined to be applied to solving specific problems. Maybe there are certain patterns of problems that are going to emerge from the pandemic. And what are the combinations of the principles that we might be able to apply to solve those specific problems? And how can we go beyond that to interpret the principles and to understand the contextual requirements of the specific needs of different kinds of problems that are going to be emerging post-pandemic, to make the solution sort of relevant to the task at hand. You know, as an information designer, when I see 24 discrete pieces of information, I have this tendency of wanting to categorize and find patterns in them and say, oh, these are clusters, and this is a great way of thinking about them. And if you do look at and examine the 24 principles, you'll see that, you know, some are goals, some are means, some talk about how designers should behave, right? There are different kinds of principles there. And thinking about the combinations of them, I think, could actually make the solutions much more stronger and much more effective rather than thinking about them as singular ones. So those are the four themes that I wanted to sort of highlight using these two images today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of the speakers. This was really wide-ranging and interesting, and we've had a couple of great questions that I think are in the spirit of the talks you just gave. So I'm going to go to the first one. We have about 10 minutes for this. So first one is from Victoria, who asks, In a culture dominated by the visual, with cities often ruled by short-term thinking, which we all know to be true, short-term policymaking, how can design envision and create spaces for new thought and awareness within the everyday living of people to enable them to learn how to listen to the pulse of life? Did you get that? Okay, make sure you're unmuted if you're answering this question, panelists.
Great question. Thank you, Victoria. I would say that that's, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Bruce.
Go ahead, Liz. Please.
I would just say one thing, that exactly that's an excellent question. It's sort of almost a mandate for thinking and design, but also for things to study that are important as a basis for that. And I think this idea that we need to obviously have individual perspectives in a rich but complex space of a city that's open-ended, but then also that those are manifested across scales in ways that are not quite visible. We need sort of the visioning, the bold visions that Tomoko told us about, but also sort of the invisible sort of ideas and phenomena that allow us to recognize how those things actually pan out and unfold over time and unfold over you know, networks of people that make them possible.
Mm-hmm. I think, I mean, actually to Tomoko's suggestion, I would combine quantify and visualize and design for perpetuity. So it's really, you know, I think one of the most important things that we do as designers is we visualize information. And when information is visualized, it becomes democratic. Right? So if it's quantitative and I look at a spreadsheet and I have to figure out the pattern in the data, I'm doing it alone. The moment I take that quantification and make it visual so I can see the city in a new way, it becomes democratic because we can all see it simultaneously. Mm-hmm. So for me, the principle of quantify and visualize is really central to being able to solve the kinds of problems that were outlined in that question. And then design for perpetuity is really trying to understand how do we think about things in the very long term. Think about, you know, imagine 8 billion people decided, yes, this is a great idea. Yes, we're going to do this. Well, you know, what are the implications of that? What does it look like when 8 billion people do something, or 8 billion people do something over and over again? And I think that's where we have to get to in our design culture, to be able to actually see the movie and not the still. Mm-hmm. You know, when we think about perpetuity, it's not so much about that discrete object. It's about, and I think this came up in different ways with all of us, the idea that it's really about these kind of embedded, complex systems of interrelationships. And that means a new kind of design. It means a new capacity for understanding it, visualizing it, and intervening in those systems. I mean, I thought the image that Dawveed showed of the two cities, I mean, it really does visualize the challenge of externality. Like the idea that that you can throw things away somewhere, including people. That is really still fundamental to the way that we think about things.
Okay, so if Dawveed and Tomoko are good to move to the next question, great.
Yeah.
So we had a question from Lara, who says, do any of the panelists have thoughts on the inherent psychology of established networks as a barrier to forming wicked teams, i.e. it's who you know? And how can we overcome our mistrust of the unknown to transcend these norms?
There's a great project at Northwestern School of Engineering where they looked at how much should a team be composed of people who've worked together before and how much should the team be made of new blood? And they found a really fascinating study. I mean, they did a study on Broadway, because everything on Broadway is quantified. So you can really see which teams perform the best over the long term. And it turns out that there is a kind of ideal ratio. I forget exactly what it was, but it's something like 70-30, that you want people who have collaborated before, but you want some new ideas and new ways of thinking to be introduced into the process. So you can actually start to quantify and design the kind of wicked team that you need in order to get consistent success. It is pretty exciting.
No, I agree with that. I think it's it is difficult. I think there's definitely, that siloing that people tend to have personally, professionally. If I went to architecture school, so most of the people I know are architects, like that's just how it is. You tend to kind of work in that way. And I think, kind of working in community, and in community around really complex issues, kind of forces you to have to broaden your scope, because you end up in situations trying to understand and kind of leverage data, as Tomoko mentioned. A lot of times we'll use census data, for instance, and it's always interesting seeing people's reaction to the census data, and sometimes it's incorrect, and the people are usually right. The people that live in that community usually know, and they'll be like, no, we don't know, that's not really right. There's actually 10 of these instead of 5, like you said, and they're here. So that sort of interaction and starting to create platforms where you can bring diverse people together around some of these complex issues. I recently participated in a charrette that was on the west side of Chicago, focused around what to do with the space underneath the Pink Line. So how that could be a community space, or how that can kind of be well used. And it was organized by some of the local community residents, and they had sort of connected with some other institutions. They brought out Walter Hood, who's a landscape architect, and a bunch of other kind of folks from different backgrounds, from arts, from business, from architecture, and we just all kind of set together around really crude tools, like it was foam and paper and scissors and glue, and start to think about things and start to prototype. And I think that sort of taking it down from kind of the suit and tie to something haptic and something kind of almost like rudimentary, like things that we all played with when we were kids, like how to use those to start to really break those boundaries and open up some opportunities to then overlap and connect.
I have to say, and I don't have an answer necessarily, but multidisciplinary work is very, very difficult. It's really hard, and we should all acknowledge that. People come in from different disciplines with different assumptions and different goals and different aspirations. And so, maybe there is a session where everybody has to sort of get aligned and get on the same page before, especially if you're working towards solving larger problems. I mean, the ways that we bring from the legacy of our own discipline, right? I mean, designers have a certain way of thinking. Other people have certain other ways of thinking. And how do you meld those together so that they can all sort of be lined up towards the same direction and working at same pace and same assumptions, right? I mean, it is very, very difficult. And so alignment becomes, I think, a huge critical part to that.
This is amazing. We've had a bunch of new questions come in, but we've also hit our time limit. It is now 2:30. I think we'll do one closing question if everyone can give us just a few more minutes. And this is very concrete. And it was asked to Dawveed, but I'd really love to hear from everybody on this. Do you have 3 big ideas to reimagine Chicago's economic and racial divides in this pandemic reset, this breach? This came from Barnaby.
Yeah, I'll get started. I don't know if I'll see if I can get 3. I mean, there's so many kind of pieces of it. I think it first starts with economic opportunity. One of the things that we saw in the pandemic, especially in underserved communities, is that economic unemployment, sort of rose in those communities. Most of those workers, essential workers, come from those communities. So people were working in grocery stores or in, sort of the UPS, facilities or FedEx or that sort of thing. So understanding how to increase economic opportunities in where people are, because a lot of these people actually do travel quite a distance as well. There's a map that CMAP created that marks out economically distressed areas as well as employment centers. And then if you overlay that with the map of, Chicago by race, right? Like Chicago's very segregated. You can kind of see the, kind of the Hispanic community, the African American community predominantly being locked out of those areas that do have jobs. So a lot of it does come down to, kind of a bit of that, but also starting to, I'd say that maybe the second thing is starting to rethink policy and how to enable and empower people to do some of the things like in Inglewood, like that I showed you. I'm teaching a studio at IIT right now, and it was interesting talking to Tanika Johnson, who's an artist. She has a project called Folded Map, looking at kind of both sides of the coin of the city of Chicago. But she brought up a point that I didn't really think about, which is, focused around ownership and use, and how in Inglewood there's all this vacant land and all these vacant buildings, but most of it's privately owned. So when they try and do something, let's say they want to take over a plot of land and have a community garden or that sort of thing, they can't do it because they are not empowered and enabled by the policies and the structure of the city of Chicago, or kind of the just in general. So really starting to look at that structure and how we can start to really enable and empower people is maybe where I'll leave it at.
I'm happy to take it next. I think if you think about the kind of DNA of design, it's empathy. The real kind of day-to-day process of what we do is really try to understand someone else's problem. And help to articulate that problem in a way that makes it solvable. So I think that at the core of design is empathy, and it's a failure of empathy. You can see a failure of empathy in racism, in anti-gay bigotry, in violence, in all the kind of whole tier of behavior and impacts that really come out of that failure of empathy. And I think that, for me, the kind of, if I could magically unlock one thing, it would be education. It would be to really change the scale and rate of education. I think the way that we do it is, the way that we approach it is going to take generations to have an impact. And we need to innovate an educational model that really has an impact in years and not decades. That has a chance of really changing things on the ground. And there are really interesting projects being developed, by different people around the world to really change that, to kind of get from a monoculture of education, which is what we have now, to a diverse ecology of education that really allows people to learn in their context, and really serve them, with total commitment.
I'd like to add to that as well. Coming out of the pandemic, this is undoubtedly has affected different people in different ways. And in many cases, this has created trauma for people, right? The fact that you've lost your job, or the fact that you have been kicked out of your apartment, the fact that you cannot pay for food. There is trauma here, and the acknowledgement of what trauma can do in accepting new information and being able to move forward in one's life, being able to create. So what I'm saying is, on top of economic and education, is the support for mental health and healing. because this is a big deal. And for some folks, you know, if you cannot overcome that, you can't have education, you can't hold a job. So I think healing is another one of the big factors here.
Yeah, I agree with everything really everyone said, and they'll say it much better than I can say anything. But I think in terms of three things, the three things are not really simple things. They're things, I would summarize them in terms of connection, outlook, and agency. That communities need at least these three things, probably more things, but sort of as a process by which people have to understand that they're part of the city and the city is part of them. We're in this together in some sense, and we have a common future. We need to have a positive outlook that each community has to have confidence and trust that their future can and will be brilliant. Okay, so that's difficult to envision. It's an exercise for design. And the last one, agency, speaks to a lot of what you said, which has to do with the fact that the future is created by people, yes, also by institutions like the city, but it has to be part of the vision for the communities, for each one of the communities in Chicago and in every city. And so the way to bring all this together, we've been thinking a lot about this at the Mansueto Institute and our role in sort of processes of community development, particularly in Chicago. And I think it does take sort of the skills of, you know, that this team represents and many more. They have to do with kind of being able to manifest the vision that really comes from communities, but it's also a bold vision for what it could be, that somehow builds the social and economic processes that can support that. And that basically builds a long-term process that will get the goals and creates the signals along the way that we're in the right path, such that gives us confidence to work together. And I think that that's a wonderful way to look at the future, but we need to be committed to it, both us individually and in our institutions, but we also need support from the rest of the city, from the city itself, from its agencies, and from other parts of the community, like the business community, to feel that they have to think of Chicago as a whole and everyone has a stake in its future.
Thank you. So we have still enough participants hanging out in this Zoom that if you all are game, I would like to ask you a closing question. It's for everybody. And the closing question is, what in your current work and practice as a scientist, as a designer, as an urbanist is giving you hope?
Huh.
Wonderful question.
That's a great question. I think that weirdly, I would say the kind of crisis of the pandemic has allowed us to see that things can change and that things that we thought were permanent are not. And I think that it gives me a kind of moment of optimism, even under these conditions, to think, yeah, we can actually confront these things that are holding us back. You know, Michael Crow at ASU talks about filiopietism, which is undue reverence for ancestors, undue reverence for the way things are. And I think that we have to think about how we develop a kind of escape velocity to create new things under these conditions. And I think the pandemic has actually, you know, accidentally given us that opportunity.
Right. I would say that obviously it's a moment of reckoning and it's a crisis, but just as Bruce said, I think if you're in the business, if I may, of design, but certainly in the business of science and research, these are optimistic enterprises. We have to believe that that you can know more and that things can be different and that can be better. Otherwise, why would you be in this line of business? It's all about, in some sense, helping vision, helping build the future together. So I think that there are a lot of things that we're learning, as Bruce said, that we're all connected, that we cannot conceive of the economy separate from health, separate from racial segregation and injustice, and that the solutions have to move all these pieces together into a new direction, and that maybe now with this reckoning, we may have the chance to actually feel that we can move them, we need to move them. So I think there's an alignment of need, of knowledge, of new methods and collaborations that can take us forward.
Yeah, agreed. I you know, share that, you know, sort of optimism, you know, understanding the depth of the challenges, but there is, you know, sort of you know, kind of hope, I think, in, you know, folks, you know, the folks I'm on this panel with, but also, kind of folks who are on this call. And I think just in general in the fields, there is this sort of desire and, kind of this hunger for like real substantive, sort of civic change and how that can, sort of manifest itself, whether that's in, sort of projects. I'm actually doing a presentation later today on Michael Reese Hospital site here in Chicago, where, we're working on redeveloping it. And, before we got into design, we started out with a series of 10 principles, that, weren't all necessarily design, sort of focused. Some of them were, like equity, vocation, like these aren't necessarily like physical, sort of physical things that manifest in, a building or a design, concept, but we want to facilitate places that inspire and allow for that sort of connectedness, and to bring nature sort of back in and start to look at how these systems that traditionally work in Chicago, even just stormwater management, where we kind of put everything into a pipe, instead of doing that, we're looking at really infiltrating as much on site as we can. And this whole project has a spine that goes through it that is sort of really about bringing nature and ecology back. Not there is this, I think, to Bruce's earlier diagram and drawing about externality, like Chicago, we have the lakefront. So a lot of times, like, people like, oh, well, you're so close to the lakefront. Well, maybe you don't need, that sort of natural space. Like, well, no, but why doesn't the natural space kind of weave its way through here, and people can kind of walk out into nature instead of having to go to nature and, go to hike, go to nature. Like, no, nature should be here in our urban spaces. So that's a, recent project that I'm really, really excited about actually making it happen, and using, as Luis put it, using the data, using, kind of the connectivity, using the opportunity to actually maybe, kind of realize those ideas in real time.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What gives me hope? I mean, this is sort of cliche as a faculty member and as a teacher, and I have students, and I'm sure there are many students on this call as well. But what gives me hope is the students that I teach. They are brave and going into this world that is so new to everybody. None of us have experienced anything like this before, and they are going out there. They are bringing attention to the factors and the types of issues that need to be addressed. So giving us a new way and a new lens of looking at the world and how to go about solving them, looking for new types of methodologies, methods, and approaches in design. So that they give me a lot of hope, actually. So hooray for the next generation.
That's a great way to. So thank you to our great audience with your questions and for sticking with us. Thank you especially to Bruce for anchoring this whole talk and for the time you've put in with us. Dawveed, Tomoko, Luis, great conversation. Don't forget MC24 at your local booksellers. And thank you all very much. We'll see you at our next Mansueto event.
Can I get the show? Doesn't read with the background.
Don't be strangers. This is great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.
Bye.
Yeah.